To the world outside Bengal, Satyajit Ray is mostly known to cinephiles as one of the most important filmmakers from India to have been successful in the art film movement. Winning the Best Human Document Award at the 1956 Cannes Film Festival for his very first film Pather Pachali established him as one of the country's most distinguished filmmakers. It is often featured in lists of the greatest films ever made.
Voici les résultats du 9e Festival international du film 1956. La Palme d'Or a été décernée au meilleur film de long métrage, Le Monde du Silence, la France. Prix spécial du jury, Le Mystère Picasso, à l'unanimité, la France. Prix de la meilleure réalisation, Othello, Urs. Prix de la meilleure interprétation, Susan Hayward, États-Unis. Prix de l'humour poétique, Sourire d'une nuit d'été, Suède. Prix du document humain, Father Panchali, Inde.
Satyajit Ray's grandfather, Upendra Kishore Ray, started a Bengali children's magazine in 1913 called Sandesh. When he passed away in 1915, his son, Shukumar Ray, father of Satyajit, succeeded as the editor of the magazine. But due to his untimely death in 1923, the magazine slowly stopped circulation. Attempts were made to revive it, but by 1934, the magazine ceased publication altogether. By the 1960s, Ray's reputation as an artist of international caliber was firmly established. He had completed the first 7 films of his prolific career and already received wide acclaim for them. In 1961, he and his friend, poet Subhash Mukhopadhyay, revived Sandesh once more. Many of Satyajit Ray's writings were first published in Sandesh. A science fiction addict. That's the phrase Satyajit Ray used to describe his love for science fiction. As a schoolboy, he was deeply fascinated by the stories of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, which germinated his interest in this particular genre. With the urge to feed Sandesh, his childhood love found a creative outlet as he wrote stories using all kinds of staple science fiction themes. Thus emerged the character of Professor Shonku, which became an extremely popular series among young and old alike. Along with his writings, Ray was actively involved with the Bengali science fiction magazine Aschurjo as its chief patron, and later became the president of the Science Fiction Cine Club, probably the first one of its kind in India as well as abroad. The Science Fiction Cine Club in Calcutta began its journey with much fanfare, the kind of attention unimaginable for a film club in India, let alone one that called itself a club of devotees of science fiction and fantasy films. Walt Disney from Disneyland, California, wrote a congratulatory letter. The Prime Minister and President sent encouraging messages. Science fiction literary legends like Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury sent their best wishes. The Press Trust of India carried a report. It was in the city's leading papers and the news segment in the radio the next morning. In the inauguration ceremony on 26 January 1966, people queued up in the portico of the Academy of Fine Arts to collect their membership cards. The 600 attendees included representatives of the different foreign embassies and personalities from Calcutta's Culturati. Brochures and souvenirs were handed out. All design-related work, from the hand-drawn insignia of the club, to conceptualizing the cover design of the brochure, to selecting the type of font, was done by Satyajit Ray. The opening film that played that evening was the British rural horror film, Village of the Damned, in which creepy blonde children, born out of an invisible alien force, terrorize the English village of Midwich.
Leave us alone.
The second film to be screened was The Incredible Shrinking Man, which is about a man who starts shrinking after he gets exposed to radioactive smoke during an yacht ride with his wife. It was shown at the Priya Cinema in South Calcutta on a Sunday morning in March. Atomic era, following World War II, the ongoing Cold War, and the prospect of man landing on moon no longer seeming impossible, the 50s were the golden age of American science fiction movies. Japan created Godzilla in 1954, and other Soviet nations like Czechoslovakia were also making their own science fiction films. Ray would get a list of strange and wonderful films from different foreign embassies and local offices of major studios. He, along with some other members of the club, would watch those films and select the one to be shown next. Sometimes, he would reject a film by watching 5 minutes of it. Once, when the Consulate of Czechoslovakia offered 3 films, Devil's Trap 1962, Creation of the World 1958, and Men in Outer Space 1962, the latter was chosen as the other two didn't have subtitles. When Fantastic Voyage 1966 came along, Ray approached 20th Century Fox for a screening. The film hadn't released in theatres in India at the time, but they happily premiered the film at the Cine Club. In 1967, when Ray couldn't get hold of Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville and François Truffaut's Fahrenheit 451, 2 films, along with Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, that got him thinking about how serious directors are showing an inclination for science fiction, he went to Bombay to get them. The Science Fiction Cine Club was the product of the efforts of a group of science fiction crusaders in Bengal in the 1960s. It was led by Adrish Bardhan, its secretary, who had approached Ray with the idea. Bengali science fiction writer Premendra Mitra was the vice president. Adrish Bardhan, who had a day job as the personal assistant to the secretary of the Calcutta Chemicals, is credited to have coined the Bengali term for science fiction, Kolpo Bigyan. He had been running Ascharjo, the little magazine dedicated to Bengali science fiction by local authors, from a room in his ancestral house on 97/1 Serpentine Lane since 1963. Ray was the magazine's chief patron and contributor, and together they started producing science fiction radio plays. As though a call for a revolution in a party manifesto, Adrish Bardhan, in the editorial of 1966 February issue of Ascharjo, wrote, "A monthly magazine, radio, and cinema. These 3 parts now will forge the victory of science fiction." The issue carried an extensive coverage of the inaugural ceremony. Satyajit Ray met Arthur C. Clarke for the first time on the sets of 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1966. They had already been corresponding over a couple of years in the early 1960s when Ray first wrote to Clarke asking him for his wishes for the Science Fiction Cine Club. Ray was invited to Elstree Studios, where Kubrick was shooting 2001. Clarke was collaborating with Stanley Kubrick in the making of 2001, based on his short story The Sentinel, a film that was to become a milestone in the science fiction genre. Ray was really impressed by what he saw. In the little time he spent at the studio, Ray observed the careful planning the production went through for designing the futuristic sets and the immaculate scale models of spaceships that were built for filming. To achieve the greatest technical authenticity, Kubrick assembled a team of astronomical artists, aeronautic specialists, and aerospace engineers to design the spacecraft interiors in the movie. In addition, Kubrick hired 3 production designers, Tony Masters, Harry Lang, and Ernest Archer. Lang had worked at NASA, and his designs, being scientifically accurate, actually required security clearance by the agency.
So we've been brought in here by Stanley Kubrick to more or less ensure the scientific integrity of the film, to make sure that it's very, very close in reality to what we're doing today in the spaceflight program. And naturally, we're looking forward 35 years, but still we want to make certain that it has a base of reality.
In London, the subject of the conversation between Ray and Clarke turned to Ray's desire to make a science fiction film. He outlined a story to Clarke in which an alien visits Earth but, and this was probably a first, isn't hostile, antagonistic, or intent on conquering Earth, but is quite friendly and playful and forms a bond with the child. This was a far cry from the way aliens were portrayed in film till then. Returning to Calcutta, Ray started to think seriously about the science fiction project, and towards the end of 1966 started working on ideas using as his base a science fiction short story he had written for Sandesh in 1962 called Bonku Babur Bondhu, about a benign alien that lands in a forest near a small village in Bengal and how it establishes contact with one of its humblest residents, Bonku Babu. The bulk of the story consisted primarily of dialogue between him and the alien creature he accidentally meets in the forest. While it was a neat short story, the characters of the alien creature and Bonku Babu were not developed enough to merit a film. Ray also knew that if he had to achieve what he was trying to envision, he would require international funding. Although his work was known in the international film festivals, he had hardly any contact in the big studios. And the question was not just about money, but also the technical expertise required to pull off a science fiction film. Meanwhile, his good friend Arthur C. Clarke, who had permanently settled in Sri Lanka, suggested Ray that he meet Mike Wilson. According to him, Mike could be instrumental in bringing the necessary contacts for him to pitch the idea. Clarke had known Mike for many years right from England. They had travelled together to several expeditions, mainly the coastal areas of Australia, the coast around Ceylon, etc. Together, they thoroughly explored the waters surrounding the island of Ceylon and researched and investigated some 40 wrecks, many of historical importance. The late 1950s also saw the start of Wilson's mercurial career in both the local and international film industries. Wilson wrote, photographed, and directed the 25-minute documentary Beneath the Seas of Ceylon in 1958. Wilson's next venture was the fantasy short film Boy Beneath the Sea, 1961. It was during the production of this film that Wilson and his mates discovered a wreck on the Great Basses containing freshly minted silver coins. all bearing the date 1702, some of which were donated to the Smithsonian Museum and to the British Museum. The feature film industry in Ceylon was in its infancy at the time, and Wilson's contribution to the development of the industry, especially in the context of his being a Westerner, was considerable. He went on to direct hit films like Ran Muthuduwa. His second film was Geta Varayo, which Clarke describes as a sort of Wild Ones on Water with a climax out of Ben-Hur but involving hydroplanes instead of chariots. Apart from directing his own films, Mike Wilson actively encouraged other aspiring directors to make movies under the banner of his company, Serendip Productions. Clarke told Wilson of Ray's idea for a science fiction film. Wilson was intrigued by it and immediately became interested in raising international finance for the project. He wrote inviting Ray to come to Colombo to discuss matters. Ray was too busy to leave Calcutta, but he could not refuse someone like Wilson, who was ready to cut his arm off to see the project lift off. Moreover, he had heard all of his achievements from Clarke, who highly recommended him. Much to Ray's surprise, Mike came to Calcutta unannounced and wanted to be in the writing sessions. Ray tried to persuade him otherwise, as writing for him was an intensely private affair. Wilson told Ray, "I shall sit by and make coffee for you when you need it, Mastro." Well, sit by he did, but Ray didn't get any coffee. Instead, much to the displeasure of Ray's wife, Bijoya Ray, Wilson was addicted to drugs and alcohol and indulged in them with a friend of his. In her book, Manik and I, My Life with Satyajit Ray, she writes, "I suffered them in silence, only with the hope of getting this film made." Meanwhile, Ray worked on the script of The Alien, for that is what the movie would be called, and soon had it ready. As a friend of Arthur C. Clarke, Wilson kept tossing ideas, all rejected or ignored, and the final script incorporated at best two suggestions that Wilson made: that the color of the alien spaceship be golden, and the word chick replaced with broad in the dialogue of a key American character. Science fiction, especially science fiction cinema, popularized by Hollywood, has always been a vehicle for big spectacle action, where the lives of good people are always in jeopardy and at the mercy of an unimaginable force of nature or an alien entity. But science fiction cinema in the 60s was gradually coming of age. Ray's idea was based on the present time and in a simple village in West Bengal, and how the lives of the villagers are affected by the presence of an alien spaceship that had accidentally dropped in the Lotus Pond. Ray saw an opportunity to comment on the social and religious aspect of village life in the context of a science fiction story. There were no chase sequences or thrill rides, and the characters were in no imminent danger from the alien, who did exhibit some superpowers. Instead, Ray approached the idea of having an alien brought down to an Indian village with simplicity and childlike wonder. The plot revolves around a spaceship that lands in a pond in rural Bengal. The villagers begin worshipping it as a temple risen from the depths of the earth. The alien establishes contact with a young village boy named Haba through dreams, and also plays a number of pranks on the village community in the course of its short stay on planet Earth. Ray's biographer Andrew Robinson describes one particular scene from the screenplay as follows. In a series of fantastically quick, short steps over the lotus leaves, the alien reaches the shore of the pond. He looks down at the grass, examines the blade, and is off hopping into the bamboo grove. There, the alien sees a small plant. His eyes light up. He passes his hand over the plant and flowers come out. A thin, soft, high-pitched laugh shows the alien is pleased. We know Ray was never the kind of filmmaker who fell for extravaganza. Instead, his approach was realistic in every aspect of filmmaking that delved in the implicit rather than the explicit. Even then, in the 60s, the Indian film industry was not equipped to produce Ray's vision of a science fiction film on the big screen. He had to rely on Hollywood if it was to be made at all. Moments after learning that Ray was thinking of the actor Peter Sellers of playing a major role in the film, Mike Wilson called the actor's agent from Ray's apartment at Lake Temple Road. Sellers is in Paris. They'll get in touch with him and find out if he's interested, is what Mike said after hanging up. In Ray's own words, while by no means a blockbuster in the Hollywood sense, the special effects in the film alone called for a budget which was high by Indian standards. If the money was to come from Hollywood, a big name or two in the cast would help, and Sellers was certainly in that category. News had come that Sellers was interested. Ray and Mike traveled to Paris in April 1967 and met Sellers at his hotel. When Ray inquired if Sellers had seen any of his work, Sellers replied no, but he mentioned, "Jonathan Miller swears by you, and his word is good enough for me." Sir Jonathan Miller was an English theatre and opera director and a TV presenter for BBC. But that was not good enough for Ray. Mike Wilson dialed to London from Sellers' suite, and a print of Charlotta arrived from the London distributors the next morning. It was screened in a mini viewing theatre the same day. As the film ended and the lights came up, Sellers turned to Ray and asked, "Why do you need me? I'm no better than your actors." In Ray's own words, of course, Sellers knew why we needed him. He was being modest.
Peter, did you see our little Indian guest last week on the Late Late Show?
Oh no, sir, I'm sorry. Because no, unfortunately I missed this gentleman because I was engaged in another activity with my friend here. We were doing things at a place I met somewhere in Castlestown, and with a lot of castles and things, and towns all together in one house. And I unfortunately missed him, so it was not possible.
Sellers heard the story and said that he liked the part. He asked Mike to be in touch with his agents. Ray came back to Calcutta, awaiting a correspondence from Mike, who had gone back to Sri Lanka and pursue the Alien project. A month later, Mike was already in Hollywood. He called Ray and confirmed that Columbia Pictures was interested. They had agreed to give him a free hand. Both Brando and Steve McQueen were keen to play the American engineer in the film. Saul Bass, the American graphic designer, best known for his design of motion picture title sequences, film posters, and corporate logos for Hollywood's most prominent filmmakers, will design the special effects. Sellers was also in Hollywood, too anxious for a second session with Ray. This was probably the moment that Ray waited all his life. Finally, his dream of making India's first science fiction film was going to come true. Ray arrived in Hollywood on 1st June 1967. Mike drove him into town in a hired Lincoln convertible. Ray found himself checking into one of the cottages of the Hotel Marmont, a self-contained two-storied cottage with all mod cons. Reading the signs of concern which Ray might have betrayed, Mike quipped, "Don't worry, Mastro. Columbia has made an advance against expenses. You can't afford anything but the best, you know. You made the Upu trilogy." The first of the many meetings Ray had with Peter Sellers was at Pandit Ravi Shankar's place, an Indian part in a new comedy called his Going Through the Motions of Playing the Sitar, and Sellers was anxious to get the fingering right. Peter Sellers of late was doing lead roles where he got the first billing. Ray casually mentioned him that in his film he would have to share the honors with the Bengali journalist hero, the American engineer, and the elfin creature from outer space. He seemed okay with it. In fact, there were several news articles in the US and UK in the following months that confirmed the involvement of Sellers in a science fiction film to be directed by Ray. For a time, both the actor and director corresponded through letters. There were other correspondences too. During his stay in Hollywood, Ray had also called upon Marlon Brando for the part of the American engineer in the film, but he had his doubts as Brando was infamous for his temperament. However, Brando had himself written back to Ray that he was interested and wanted to be excused for not being able to meet him during his stay in the US due to personal reasons. Steve McQueen had showed interest too, to come down to India and work with him if the part was right. Then there were others like Haskell Wexler, who had already won an Academy Award for Best Cinematography for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1966. He wrote, "I am afraid my phone conversations said very little of what I would like to say. Anyway, please know I am available and would be honored to work for you on any film without pay. After this Steve McQueen picture, I will only work on projects of my own or with directors whose philosophy of life has meaning for me." But there were a few things that worried Ray. The most important being able to make the film the way he wanted to. In Calcutta, he had already made a career in advertising before venturing into films. Although it allowed him to grow as an illustrator and visual composer, there was hardly a scope to express himself.
What I was getting slightly fed up was this having to deal with the clients, working as almost as a... No, that was very demeaning, I found. Often. You have very few enlightened clients, actually. Very demeaning, and I was really getting very tired of advertising, and I wanted to be absolutely free as an artist.
With his varied interests in the different aspects of the art and technique of the profession, and his aptitude for multitasking, he always had the final call. Working in Bengal allowed him his comfort zone. He had to make sure Hollywood gave him the same control. Another reason for worry was the flamboyant and suspicious Mike Wilson. Although he appeared among the sprucest and trimmest of men, yet he was addicted to pot, and every evening was accompanied by a group of hippies to the Marmont Hotel, the cottage where he had apparently set up office for the Alien Project. Then one day, Ray found mimeographed copies of his script at Mike's cottage that bore the legend, "Copyright Mike Wilson and Satyajit Ray." On questioning, he explained that this was done to make doubly sure that Mr. Ray's interests were protected. Two heads are better than one, Mastro. In fact, a young executive at Columbia had asked Ray why he needed Mike at all, and who was he and the nature of their partnership. Ray asked himself the same question and probably was not ready to part with him as yet. Out of a sense of gratitude, for it was Mike who made the initial phone calls, although he understood that Mike was trying to make the most out of the situation, and by unfair means. As Ray left Hollywood after his 5-week stay, he could feel that the Alien Project was doomed. But there was hope yet. Peter Sellers was still interested. For some reason, Columbia Pictures passed on the Alien Project to its British counterpart, Columbia British. They were still interested in doing the film. Ray found himself traveling to London this time. The bosses at Columbia in the UK were anxious to meet him. Mike Wilson had reached there a week before and checked him in a suite at the Hiltons. Ray wondered if the advance from Columbia still allowed such luxury. But far more worrying than this was Mike's erratic behavior. He bugged their phones and recorded every bit of conversation they had about the alien project. He even hid a small cassette recorder in his briefcase and surreptitiously recorded all meetings they had at the offices of Columbia. Ray questioned the ethics of this operation. Mike justified his actions by saying that it was supposed to guarantee that they were not cheated by the studio. Ray managed only one meeting with Columbia executives in Mike's absence. It was then that they asked him if he received the $10,000 advance for his screenplay that Mike took on his behalf in the US. Ray was absolutely unaware of it. This meant that Mike used that money to live the flamboyant life in the US and still continued to do so in London. This broke whatever trust Ray had for Mike. Moreover, Mike doubted himself as the associate producer of the film, and when the studio wanted to confirm the same, Ray said that there was no such arrangement between them, at least not on paper. Nothing came out of his stay in London either. There was no deal yet again, and it was soon time to leave. On the way back to the airport, Mike commissioned a Rolls-Royce with a built-in cocktail cabinet. He slapped a sheaf of paper on Ray's knees, saying if he would just sign here, Mastro. Ray refused, telling him that it's impossible for him to sign anything inside a car, even if it's a Rolls-Royce, and asked him instead to send the papers to Calcutta, where he could read them. Ray returned home. The papers never arrived. But an executive from Columbia Pictures was sent to Calcutta with a message that the studio would continue with the alien provided that Mike Wilson was no longer a part of it. The executive wanted Ray to write to Wilson and ask him to pull out. Ray wrote the letter only to get a sizzling reply that called Ray a slanderer and a thief. But what shocked him most was another letter. It was from Peter Sellers some time later. Sellers had lost his interest in the alien project. He wrote, "Though the part may appear more or less complete to you, it does not seem to me, and I don't see how I could contemplate playing it as it is." Apparently, Columbia was still interested, but Wilson had to pull out. Seeing no other alternative, Ray wrote to the one person who could help, Arthur C. Clarke. Outlining what happened, he wrote with a heartfelt plea, "I'm depending a great deal on you, Arthur." But silence ensued. Meanwhile, mimeographed copies of the alien script were still circulating in Hollywood. October 1969. Unexpectedly, after almost a year of no activity on the subject, a brief note arrived from Clarke, informing Ray that Wilson had shaved his head and gone off to meditate in the jungles of South India. Soon, a letter arrived from Swami Sivakalki, the name Mike Wilson took on when he became a monk. In the words of Ray, he was relinquishing his rights to the screenplay, although obviously too close to sainthood to spell it out in mundane terms. This is the way he chose to put it. "Dear Ravana, you may keep Sita. She is yours. Keep her and make her and the world happy." Meanwhile, mimeographed copies of the alien script were still circulating in Hollywood. Ray was no longer interested in the alien, disillusioned by the whole experience. But over the course of the next decade or so, he did continue to think of it as possible someday, sometime in the future, encouraged as he was at frequent intervals by people such as Ismail Merchant Peter Sellers' Ex-Agent by Columbia and several others. Meanwhile, mimeographed copies of the Alien script were still circulating in Hollywood. The final nail to the coffin was the release of the 1982 blockbuster film E.T., the Extra-Terrestrial, by Steven Spielberg.
It's called E.T., which stands for Extra-Terrestrial, which is about a visit to this planet by a space creature.
Ray, of course, was among the first to note the similarities, starting with the startling commonality that E.T. had with Ray's concept of the alien. The benign nature of the creature and the fact that it is small and acceptable to children, and possessed of certain superhuman powers, not physical strength, and that it takes interest in earthly things. Another person who noted the striking parallels was Arthur C. Clarke, who called Ray from Colombo in 1983, suggesting he write to Spielberg politely and point out the resemblances. In an interview with India Today magazine in February 1983, Ray had asserted, E.T. would not have been possible without my script of the alien being available throughout the United States in mimeographed copies.
Long before E.T., and my science fiction screenplay was germinated from that story, The Alien.
What's yours?
I wrote a science fiction story called The Alien, screenplay, full screenplay, which was supposed to be financed by Columbia. That is why I spent 5 weeks in Hollywood in connection with that. It's only that I had a person who was working as a middleman who behaved peculiarly, and the idea had to be dropped.
Asim Chabra was a young journalist student at Columbia University, and as a fan of Ray and Spielberg films, this interview piqued his interest. He had seen Ray's sketches of the alien in British author Mary Seaton's book, Portrait of a Director, Satyajit Ray, and how they resembled the friendly creatures that came out of the mothership towards the end of Close Encounters. There was a story here, he told his professors at Columbia University. So he typed a letter to Clarke which he mailed to his publisher. He also sent a letter to Ray with a set of questions, and he made phone calls to Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment office in California, but had no luck in talking to the director. While he waited patiently to hear back from Ray and Clarke, a friend at Columbia University's film school surprised him with a copy of the Alien script. The previous summer, this friend had interned at Merchant Ivory Productions' office in Bombay, where he found the script. Ray was close to Ismail Merchant and James Ivory. One day, Asim's friend borrowed the script, but then conveniently forgot to return it. Reading the script, Asim realized that indeed there were similarities between E.T. and the alien. His interview with Clarke went well. He was warm, very approachable and friendly. And this is what he said to Asim. I told Satyajit that he should write politely to Spielberg and say, look, there are a lot of similarities here, but don't make any charges or threats. Asim then called Mary Seaton, who gladly agreed to give him Satyajit's phone number. And that is how he called Ray from his dorm room in New York City. Ray agreed to talk. He said that he had spoken to an attorney in Calcutta and discussed the possibility of suing Spielberg on plagiarism charges. And he told Asim that Columbia Pictures had circulated dozens and dozens of copies of his script. But Ray was also concerned that Spielberg had made the necessary changes so that there is no case. There is no legal action possible in those circumstances. Mostly Ray sounded dejected. Sometimes I feel ought to do something about it. But here I am in India in the middle of film myself. He was making Ghore at the time. He said to Asim, I can't do anything by correspondence, besides, Spielberg can deny it. What he has done is ruin my chance of making the film, because then people will say it came from Spielberg. But then Ray also added that he was not in a vindictive mood, and that Spielberg has made good films and he's a good director. The story Asim wrote with Ray's and Clark's voices was circulated to several newspapers by the Columbia News Service as part of the journalism school program. And the story broke in the middle of voting for that year's Academy Awards, where E.T. and Gandhi were the front runners. Some reporters wondered if Asim, being an Indian, wrote the story because he wanted Gandhi to win.
Gandhi, Richard Attenborough, producer.
Los Angeles Times did 3 follow-up stories based on Asim's article. The New York Times even quoted an unnamed spokesperson from Spielberg's office saying that the director was frustrated by Ray's allegations. But when the issue was raised by the press, Spielberg denied this claim and said, "I was a kid in high school when his script was circulating in Hollywood." Star Weekend magazine disputed Spielberg's claim, pointing out that he had graduated from high school in 1965 and began his career in Hollywood in 1969. The Times of India noted that E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind had remarkable parallels with the alien. These parallels include the physical nature of the alien. In his screenplay, which Ray wrote entirely in English, he described the alien as a cross between a gnome and a famished refugee child. Large head, spindly limbs, a lean torso. Is it male or female or neuter? We don't know. What its form basically conveys is a kind of ethereal innocence, and it is difficult to associate either great evil or great power with it. Yet, a feeling of eeriness is there because of the resemblance to a sickly human child. In this regard, it should also be noted that Spielberg's E.T. started out as a Columbia project, who had Ray's script for 2 decades now.
I was going to do E.T. for Columbia, and they liked the script, but Columbia chose another movie they had in development called Starman that eventually became a wonderful movie starring Jeff Bridges. They chose that over E.T., and they said, but look, we're not going to make your movie, but we'll certainly give it back to you to take anywhere you'd like. And I got the rights back and took it immediately to Sid Sheinberg, my mentor, my friend, and the head of Universal Studios. And I showed him the script to decide whether he wanted to make the movie or not. And the next day he called up and he said, "I think it's a very good idea for a movie. Go ahead and do it." So we set off to make the picture at that time.
Columbia Pictures CEO Frank Price passed on the project, thus putting it in a turnaround, arrangements under which producers can move a project from one studio to another under certain conditions. So Spielberg approached the more receptive Sid Sheinberg, president of MCA, the then parent company of Universal Studios. Spielberg told Sheinberg to acquire the E.T. script from Columbia Pictures, which he did for $1 million, and struck a deal with Price in which Columbia would retain 5% of the film's net profits. Let us also note that Spielberg's E.T. is the first movie in motion picture history where an alien visitor has no interest in contact with humans, either hostile or for friendly visitation. It is here as a botanist. E.T.'s interactions with the children is purely accidental. Here's another uncanny resemblance with Satyajit Ray's intended scenario that he wanted to achieve back in the late 60s. In 1983, while working on Ghore Baire, based on Rabindranath Tagore's novel of the same name, Ray suffered a heart attack. It would severely limit his productivity. The film was completed in 1984. It is about the dangers of fervent nationalism. Critic Vincent Canby gave the film a maximum rating of 5 stars. Ray received the Commander of the National Order of the Legion of Honor, the highest decoration in France, in 1987, from French President François Mitterrand, who had come down to Calcutta specially to honor him.
Satyajit Ray, Commander of the Ladies of Honor. We make you Commander of the Legion of Honor.
Ray's last film was Aguntuk, The Stranger. It provoked far-ranging questions about man and civilization in particular. Critic Hal Hinson was impressed and thought Aguntuk shows all the virtues of a master artist in full maturity. During November 1991, two legendary personalities of Hollywood, Martin Scorsese and Ismail Merchant, started a letter campaign on their own for a Lifetime Achievement Oscar to Satyajit Ray. They viewed that Ray had cast an immense impact on present generation of filmmakers. Ray's humanism, irony, humor, his villains and heroes, and feeling for his characters, all these have left a deep impression on the works of all the young directors. Scorsese and Merchant sent copies of their letter to many luminaries of Hollywood and requested them to join the campaign. All of them agreed and sent their consent to Carl Malden, President of Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences. Among the 63 famous personalities who signed the campaign were George Lucas, Bernardo Bertolucci, Sidney Lumet, Mike Nichols, Jonathan Demme, Robert Redford, Charlton Heston, Gregory Peck, Lauren Bacall, and last but not the least, Steven Spielberg. Copies of these letters were sent to the Ray family in Calcutta. In 1992, Ray's health deteriorated due to heart complications. He had been suffering from a heart ailment compounded by breathing problems and was admitted to Bellevue Hospital in Calcutta on 29th January. Ray was planning to go to the US to receive the award himself as well as visit cardiologists in the US.
Many congratulations for your Oscar. What does this mean to you?
Oh, it means the end of prizes, I think. There's nothing more after this. I'm delighted. I'm very happy because, of course, Oscar is something very, very special. And I'm surprised because not many of my films have been shown in the States. But obviously there are some people who are aware of what I'm doing. And they're paying a tribute. I'm happy, very happy.
Do you think you will go to Los Angeles to receive your Oscar?
It's up to my doctor, frankly speaking. I mean, if he feels that I'm in a position to go, I'll go. I would love to go. This is one invitation that I would like to accept. Because, we started as a film fan, and thinking of Hollywood as a faraway dream place kind of thing. Never imagining that I would be making films myself and they would be accepted abroad and they would end up with an Oscar.
But his failing health would not allow him to touch the shores of Hollywood once more. He never got to direct his dream Hollywood film, but this was Hollywood finally recognizing his achievement as a master of cinema. Instead, a 3-member delegation from the Oscar committee visited him at the hospital on 16th March to present him with the Golden Statuette. The occasion was filmed and Mr. Ray's acceptance speech was shown as part of the Academy Awards broadcast on 30th March.
The Academy recognizes Mr. Ray's rare mastery of the art of motion pictures and of his profound humanism, which has had an indelible influence on filmmakers and audiences throughout the world. Unfortunately, Mr. Ray is not well and cannot be with us tonight, but he is able to speak with us from his hospital room in Calcutta.
Well, it's been an extraordinary experience for me to be here tonight to receive this magnificent award, certainly the best achievement of my movie-making career.
He expressed his appreciation for Hollywood cinema, even as a boy, and the influence it had in his own work. But there was no mention of the fact that in his prime he had come so close to directing a Hollywood film himself. 24 days later, on 23rd April 1992, 9 days before his 71st birthday, Satyajit Ray passed away.